Welcome to the atrium at the Cathedral of St. Philip in Atlanta, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have a special Advent edition of Conversations with Priests. We're streaming tonight on Facebook Live, and we're Zooming. I'm Terry Blair. I'm an avid reader. You may have seen me here over the years browsing through the books at the bookstore. But how did I get to have the honor tonight to introduce these two mighty women? I think our store manager, Corey Lights, saw the twinkle in my eye as I talked about Barbara Brown Taylor and Cathy Zappa. But before I do a formal introduction, two housekeeping notes. Please mute your mics. It will help with the audio portion. And remember, you can post questions in the chat box. Many of you know Cathy Zappa, the Cathedral's Canon for Liturgy and Pastoral Care. Imagine what those responsibilities have been the last 10 months. But do you know about her ministry at Arundel State Prison for Women? She is the program director for the Certificate of Theology program. She has developed the library and classes there. And most of you know Barbara Brown Taylor, who needs no introduction, as a priest and a professor. But did you know she's also taught theology classes at Arundel? I'm not going to go on and on about Barbara Brown Taylor's awards and New York Times bestsellers, but I suggest you go to the website. It's an awesome collection. I just want to remind you why we love her books. When she tells a story or reinterprets a story, she makes us laugh, she makes us cry, but moreover, she makes us think. She connects the heart to the mind and shifts paradigms. Tonight, we are especially interested in her new book, published in October 2020, Always a Guest, a collection of 20 of her best sermons as a guest speaker. Do you remember when Baylor recognized her as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English language? So here are 20 of her best just in time for Christmas. Many of us ordered our books already, but I'm sure you can call the bookstore or you can go online and get your copy. And I can't help but adding that she had another publication this fall. She contributed an essay to the new anthology about Howard Thurman, Anchored in the Current, and you can order that through the bookstore too.
Greg Ellison was just on our forum on Sunday.
As Barbara is a preacher and a teacher, so is Cathy. Cathy had a BA and an MA in German, later took an English degree intending to teach. And teach she does. Her classes and meditations have sustained us, especially the last 10 months. But serving as canon for pastoral care in 2020 with 7,000 parishioners at St. Philip's has to be a challenge. How do these two mighty women do it all? Well, pull up your chair and let's find out. Cathy and Bob.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Terry. What a lovely introduction. I'm humbled by it. I had a similar twinkle in my eye when I was invited to do this because your books have really been a part of my spiritual journey. I've even used this in a sermon that I don't know that I'd be a priest, I think, if it hadn't been for yours. It's true. Sort of the way you opened up faith to me, and I still remember in the preaching life, you saying, you know, you're kind of wondering what you were going to do and what you're being called to, and hearing the voice, I'm sure I'll get the story wrong, but God's saying, do whatever you want to do and love me. And so I kind of continue to, I think, grow and follow you, and I think part of what Terry was getting at is see truth, see my own truth in your writings. And this book is no exception, and I'm really excited to talk about where you are now and what you're learning about faith, because I always seem to be learning just a little bit behind you. So I'm curious, where are you now? What are you doing now? And
Right this minute, I'm a guest.
Yeah.
I'm a guest, and I'm so grateful to my hosts, to Corey, Terry, and Kathy, especially you, because here are, 2 women clergy in the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, one with her collar on and one without her collar on, who have been in and out of a lot of the same places for a long time. So I'm very, very happy to be your guest tonight and to be here. I think because I switched to first person writing a long time ago, everybody knows more than they want to about what's going on with me. So, but I have lived in Habersham County, Georgia, population 42,000 since 1992. So that's a long time now, almost 30 years. So I was telling Kathy over dinner, I feel like I've lived several lives now, an Atlanta life and a Clarksville life and an academic life and a church life. And it's one of the kind of befuddling gifts of getting older is to see your life as an ocean. It's not a stream anymore, and it's not even a river. It's really an ocean of relationship and experience and wonderful brick walls that knocked me down and other doors that opened even when I didn't have a key. So where I am now is retired. I'm supposed to be retired. The person in the mailroom at Piedmont College said, "You'll never know how you had time to work." And she turned out to be exactly right. So I'm a farm wife. I haul hay. You strained yourself picking up a candlestick today.
I did, yes.
And I strained myself with a bale of hay. So it's still 2 mighty women lifting things that are too heavy for them, right?
Yes.
And Kathy's got her mask on. I should say that the others of us don't with permission. We are guests here who've been given permission to breach the protocol somewhat. But I do appreciate your care and the care of this church for guests like me who taking care of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I can, I won't start with my birth in 1951. We talked about that earlier, but I've had a great run. At 2 jobs I have loved so much, and they have more in common than most people know. We can talk about that later. Churches and classrooms.
Yeah.
A lot in common.
Do you want to talk about it later, or do you want to talk about it now? I'm kind of curious.
Well, at first it was really disorienting, to go from knowing what I would put on every day. I mean, to open my closet was to see black and gray and white stripes, and gray. And all of a sudden to have a green dress that I could put on was just very odd to go to work in color and in things other than my suits. And I was in front of a blackboard instead of a Reredos, behind me. And I couldn't use we. The biggest shift was pronouns. I couldn't say we believe or we think or we are called or we as we know. That didn't work in the classroom because people came from all over the place. Christian, alienated from Christian, different kinds of Christians I'd never been with in my life. So, but quickly I looked out and saw, I couldn't help it, a kind of congregation. People who had gathered, though for credit and a grade, but who, heaven and hell used to be credit and a grade, right?
Right, that's true.
But who gathered that way, and I had a short time, 15 weeks, to put some boundaries around it so it was a safe place to ask questions and wonder out loud about things and do things in the classroom they couldn't do in their churches because the classroom was a secondary place, not a primary place. And I always said that to them. Don't figure out your faith here. Figure out your faith in your churches. But if you have questions you can't ask in church, this is a great place to come. So it was all about people. It was still about people and community, just a shorter period of time.
Yeah. Well, and it makes, I'm just sitting here thinking about part of how I became an Episcopalian was it was a place where you could ask questions. And, I grew up in I don't know if it was the tradition or just the people I was around, but, where questions made other people uncomfortable. And so I'm wondering if the church couldn't also be a place where we can ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and I don't even talk about church anymore. I talk about churches, and there are plenty of churches you can, and plenty of churches where you better not. So churches are plural, just like the people in them are plural. But I'm interested, if you intended to be a teacher, what attracted you? Was that a first call for you to teach?
I had several. I wandered in a short period of time. I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I taught. I worked in a scuba shop. I mean, I've done a little, I went through this, worked as a proofreader, but yeah, I think I've always had a teaching part. And even when I worked in the scuba shop, I taught ESL, so I think that's always been something that's been interesting to me, and something I love about being a priest. You know, whether we're teaching or we're doing a Bible study or even a pastoral conversation, I think there's some teaching and learning that's happening in all of it.
And you're still in the business of, because we are in this particular church, and I know it fairly well, you're in the business of opening minds still. You're in the business of allowing critical thinking and hard questions. And I assume even people who say, I gave up on God ages ago, but I really like you people. Can I hang around? And we say, sure.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah,
To hang
absolutely.
around. But it's so much fun to be there. You write the syllabus. You write the course objectives. So what I admire about what you do, different from what I did for the last 20 years, is you work in community with a collar, with a title, you know, with a role in the congregation, but you work in community and cooperation more than I ever did in the classroom.
Yeah.
And you can't give grades, or can you?
You can't give, well, no, that's not ours to do. That's not, we get graded.
Yeah, that's kind of the flip I'm thinking of. Yeah, you get graded.
Yeah, we get. Yeah, I loved one thing. I think it was this book where you said, having been married to a churchgoer, that you know that critiquing the sermon is a beloved sport.
A group sport in every
sport,
church.
Yes. I'm sure nobody watching can relate to that. But.
Yeah. I don't think she was as good as she was last time. Do you? I don't get that, you know, best this or that, or well, she's good, but she's not, you know. Yeah, we all get graded, even when we're graded, you know, against ourselves. But hey, I've had all kinds of people, bank presidents and RNs, and everybody say, this is not your problem alone, dear. This is the problem of anybody who operates with other people. It's, we're all sort of checking each other out all the time.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I think it's been a growing thing for me too. You know, what we do when you're writing or when you're teaching or when you're preaching, you know, we're putting ourselves out there. We're offering a view it's kind of up for grabs. It then belongs to everyone in the room. And some of the critiques or responses have really developed me. I mean, I just think about, I've told the story before, but talking about somebody I knew on death row. I think you knew her too. And someone in the congregation came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I lost someone as a victim of a crime, and it just made me think, I need to think differently. It just got me out of my one view, my one angle that I was looking at things with. So.
Yeah, that's how Sister Helen Prejean got in trouble, right? But I think this was made clear in the introduction, but the reason I know anything about Arendelle is because of Cathy and the Certificate in Theological Studies program, which is a joint program, of Columbia Theological Seminary, Emory,
You need to go outside?
School of Theology, McAfee School of Theology, and the Interdenominational Theological Center. So four seminaries, and it was the most remarkable teaching experience of my life. I've never had students who did all their homework.
I know.
Who turned everything in on
They're
time.
grateful that you're there.
And also who needed to be given paper and pencils. I mean, I had to bring those and collect them back up at the end.
Yeah.
But what a bunch of dedicated students. And my course, I don't know if you remember, but it was on memoir
Writing memoirs, yes.
And the job was to come up with 500-word memoirs, which women read in front of their classmates. That was the most touching thing I have ever heard. And they came so far from the way they started telling their stories. In just 8 weeks, wasn't it just 8 weeks?
12.
It just seemed like 8.
It seems like you might have lost a few sessions.
But it was, I really thank you for helping me dip my foot in there. It was changed me.
It's a program that's still going strong. I'm not directing it, but it's still going strong. And but that's a place I think where we both experienced being a guest. I mean, when I came
That's what I
in,
was just going to say, because I spoke at one baccalaureate there, but that's a very particular congregation.
And I mean, a lot of the things that you said in this book about the gifts of being a guest, I experienced there, like the we language, you know, and just realizing I can't assume that everyone has means the same thing when they use the word God or sin or judgment.
Yeah, we were talking earlier too, it's also a mistake for those of us who have loved church and been loved by churches to assume everyone has that experience.
Right.
Because you can't be in parish ministry 12 minutes without meeting somebody who's been chewed up, spit out by a church somewhere. So that also was a new learning when I began to venture out past churches I had loved who had loved me.
Yeah. I sometimes saw that theology program and the work that the students were doing and that we were doing with them as kind of theological rehabilitation. You know, just realizing that there are other ways you can see God in other faces of the church, and not telling anyone what it had to be, but just creating space to explore and ask questions. It was fun. It's holy ground.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I don't think anything I said there made it in here, partly because it felt too personal. A lot of these sermons were sort of guest appearance things that were not to 7,000 people. How many people can you get in church here?
We don't get that much people.
Okay. 10 services on Sunday, right? 700 each time.
I think they're the number of people in the books, and then they're the people who come to church. And there's so many different ways to plug into church.
That's right. Oh, in the good old days, for any of you who are not Episcopalians, you only had to go 3 times a year to be able to be buried from the church. So some people just Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and that was it. And now we expect a little more.
Yeah, we don't take attendance though. Yeah. We don't take attendance.
Kathy and I were talking about whether we assumed this was an Episcopal audience, and we assume a number of people are because of the bookstore. But as I was talking about at dinner, one of the big surprises, first of all, was trying to come up with this was supposed to be a much fatter book. It was supposed to be like the collected sermons of Barbara Taylor. And then I looked through the sermons of the last 20 years, which is how long I've been a guest preacher, and I found 31 that didn't embarrass me, which is really sad, so it's a tidy little book instead. And what I realized is Presbyterians have invited me to their churches more than any denomination.
Yeah.
That was so interesting.
And there are a lot of trinities of different denominations.
Yes, isn't that? It's so much fun to look back at just the sermons that came from where and that hold up, because sermons are supposed to be tuned to the moment. We can talk about preaching now, but they're tuned to the moment, and that is as it should be. It's fresh bread. So this is a loaf of stale bread. And in a way, if those sermons are not dated, what's wrong with them? They ought to be dated. If they were meant for the moment. And I also had to weed those out.
Yeah.
9/11 sermons or the Great Recession sermons had to go because that has so receded in memory. But how often do you preach here?
It depends. Probably about once a month to every 6 weeks in the nave, like with our big services. But we also have weekly daily services. We have multiple. So probably once a week if you think about all the different forms of preaching. But you answered. Well, were you going to go somewhere else?
Oh, I was going to say is that's what people who aren't in the biz may not know is you can preach the same sermon at 9:30 and 11 and get 2 different responses to the same sermon. And if you try it on Wednesday in front of 12 people, it's not going to work at all.
Yeah.
So it's really wonderful, I think, to watch the ways the word takes shape in different groups of people.
Yeah.
At different times of day.
Well, and I remember, preaching a sermon here at the Cathedral and then doing the same sermon in a different context, and how much I had to completely change, because so much of it does have to do with, I think you said that in here too, where you are, when you, or who you are when you're hearing it. But you answered one question I had, which was how you picked, maybe there's more to the answer, but how you picked the sermons that are in here.
I tried to pick sermons that had some shelf life and that could be general enough not general enough. I mean, the odd experience was reading this book for audio, the audio version. So reading 31 sermons over 24 hours roughly was bizarre. Because any preacher who hasn't done that, probably any teacher who compiles lectures needs to look and see what it's like when they come bang, 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 bang. Because sermons need to be about a week apart, right? And I felt like I was at my own triple revival and really needed air to get out of there. But I realized that a lot of these sermons were about questioning received teachings about what these texts meant. And that I had a lot of freedom as a guest of questioning received meanings. Like the parable of the talents stands out. I won't rehearse the whole parable, but basically the guy who was so scared of his master that he buried his money got thrown into hell, while the kind of crookish guy who got a lot of money and gambled on it and won ends up sounding rewarded. And when I got done reading that sermon, I thought, oh, I want to get called a Marxist for this one. I know I'm going to be called a socialist commie for this one. But it was one of my favorite sermons in there, because it ended up being about how Scripture doesn't lie inert on the page. Scripture comes alive in the community that reads it and hears it and talks about it. And so if the meaning does not change, never changes, it's not a living word.
Offer a sermon and people, just like with the scripture, you kind of receive what you need to. I love that you said, this parable, like with the scripture, you kind of receive what you need to. I love that you said, this parable stinks. You said something, I don't remember what your word was. I was quoting
someone, but yeah, I picked him.
I don't remember what the word was exactly, but just the freedom to say, when did we decide that this master was God? And, I've always felt like, well,
this harsh, mean master.
This harsh, mean master is God, and this punishing master. And it was refreshing to go, I talk about assumptions you can let go of, how the parable totally changes when you let go of that assumption. But I wonder if that's the kind of freedom you're talking about, that you get, because I feel like, well, I've got to defend God and the way that this has been interpreted, or I've heard it.
Well, when you're a guest preacher, you still get graded, for sure.
Yeah.
But you go away. And I one of my favorite images in there is you're like the babysitter who shows up with steel darts and a dartboard instead of a Monopoly game, because you're kind of dangerous. How'd you get here?
Right.
And whether I like it or don't, you'll leave. You're going to leave, aren't you? The babysitter is going to go home. And there's tremendous freedom in that. It was really wonderful to know those were the terms under which I'd been invited. And frankly, the times the regular minister was there, to know that he or she had a weekend off. And that person was having a whole different kind of weekend, so that it had a festival air to it in most cases.
Yeah.
So I loved it. I loved being a guest, and I loved the challenge of moving from they were all mainline. I mean, I hardly ever went anywhere. I went a couple places that were Pentecostal, and I really was on edge there until I got used to some of the come on, some of the call and response, and then I just left my manuscript. I just didn't care. I just wanted to say anything that would get me some more of that. So it was a really interesting experience. But at any rate, to move from that kind of setting to a Lutheran setting where nobody laughed in church, I learned to ask, do people laugh here or not? And then to kind of go home to the Episcopalians and a couple Baptist churches. But it was a lot of fun to run into they were not just denominational norms, they were congregational norms of how people were together.
Right.
And to come in and be the guest and the stranger there meant I was going to do something stupid for sure.
Yeah.
But it was okay, because I was going to go home.
Yeah. And they'll still be there. They'll keep going.
One of the worst things I remember, it's not in this book, but I went to a Good Friday series that I did in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it was Good Friday, and one of my examples was a young man who'd been killed in a car wreck and the aftermath of that. And the rector came up to me and said, could you change that? Because we just buried a young man here last week. Could you make it a tornado? And I thought, really? No, I can't make it a tornado. But it was that's one of the kind of, not a gaffe exactly, but it's where a guest preacher is at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah.
So that I learned to write ahead of time and say, send me the last 2 or 3 sermons in a row, what's been going on, where are the potholes, anything I should not go near. So that was another consequence of being a guest. You don't have to ask those questions when you stand up here, right?
Hopefully. I mean, this is such a big congregation, we don't know everything, but you're right. It does help to have a sense, and to know if there's been some major event in the life of the parish. Absolutely right. Yeah, you said, and so that sounds like one of the ways, thinking through, well, what do I need to know about this congregation, that those of us showing up week after week don't have to ask ourselves. But your first line in here was that being a guest, when I left parish ministry 20 years earlier than expected, my preaching life was born again.
A whole different way of going at it.
Yeah. Could you say more about how it changed? So it's free, you talked about that.
Well, I had to get real elemental because I didn't know the congregation well. So I couldn't talk about the stewardship campaign or church school, just things going on in the life of the parish. It had to be about wanting to belong, or being afraid you're going to die, or losing somebody you love, or finding somebody to love. It had to be elemental human things, which I think made me, more of a humanist preacher, if you need a label for it. So that the Christ, Jesus, Holy Spirit stuff was there when I had a text, but I tried to always touch down, into kind of basic human stuff, so that anybody listening, including a guest on that Sunday who never walked into the place before, could touch down. I learned to give up my beautiful denominational language. I just quit talking, using all those multisyllabic words I learned in seminary. Purificators and nartheses and sacristies and things. I had to let them go because they were like code language, and they kept people out instead of welcoming them in. So there was that, and then there's the other thing about knowing I would come and go, and people didn't have high stakes. I could relax a little bit knowing that. So that changed. And then another thing changed when I retired, because when you're clergy, I know where you are on Sundays. And my friend Martha Stern, whom you may know, she retired and I retired, so we started visiting places on Sundays together. We went to Mount Perrin Church of God, and we went to a fabulous, predominantly African-American church in Decatur. We went to a little storefront multinational Episcopal church out somewhere off Buford Highway. And it was so much fun to sit in the pew in a really different tradition. So look forward to that when you retire, if you get to. And maybe you visit now. Do you have ways to visit? You don't.
Not real. Well, that's one of the things about this. Well, one of the things about the situation we're in, where we're doing services online, I can visit now.
Oh, that's true.
And virtually, I can visit all kinds of churches.
That's true.
Which has been wonderful. But before that, no. I could go when I'm on vacation, but I don't always.
Gee.
Just grab that from the record.
Well, doctors don't go to the ER just to see if anybody needs any help when you're on vacation either. So
that's true. Yeah, that was something else I've appreciated. This is kind of going back into other writings, but an altar in the world, and you recognizing that there's holiness and there's church happening in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of places.
How do we, we just talked about what do you mean when you say God, but what do you mean when you say church?
Right.
Because there's one Episcopal church in my entire county. You go there, or you go to another county to go to church. And so church for me, that particular community is very dear to me, though I'm not there. There's a lot of continuity there. But church to me means sort of where we have a prayer, and oh God, for those whose faith is known to you alone. There's a way in which there are faithful people who never put faith language on what they do, but I have found a large community of the faithful, who aren't related to a particular denomination, or many, or they belong to quilting circles, and they clean up the river, on their days off. Again, not so much in 2020, but church has gotten bigger for me. But it's concentric circles of meaning of that word. The word can mean this much, and then it can go back down to the baptized. Though it still kind of sticks in my whatever that we are supposed to only give communion to the baptized. Because Quakers aren't baptized, and Salvation Army people are not baptized. But I do have circles of understanding, probably about God too.
Well, I think of faith even in circles of understanding. I mean, we can use this narrow idea of, faith is what you say you believe, or my faith as an Episcopalian or as a Christian. And then faith also kind of expands to just your relationship with the divine.
One of those sermons I had to grapple with that faith as trust is real different from believing. I believe this, I believe that. I do believe God is revealed in human beings and in all that God has created. That's a belief. I do believe something wonderful happens when people share bread and wine and prayer around the table together. So I have beliefs, but I trust in stuff far beyond my beliefs.
Can I read this? I marked like two little short passages that I thought we might talk about, but one of them was beliefs. I think this is an amazing line, and I'd love to hear you talk.
I'm so flattered you read the book, Kathy. We could have
I highly
done
recommend
this
reading the
whole
book.
thing. You didn't have to read the book.
I've read many of your books. Like I said, you have no idea, but it's the chapter on the good heretic, which is what the parable that many of us know as the Good Samaritan. And you say, I don't know about you, but as a young Christian, I was taught to get my beliefs in order before I did things. Before I went out with a boy, I should be sure I knew what I believed about right relationships between girls and boys. Before I engaged someone of another faith in conversation, I should be sure I knew what I believed about that person's salvation. Before I spent my paycheck, I should make sure I knew what I believed about giving back to God. And this is where the rubber hit the road for me. But in many ways, that was great advice. But based on the story of the Good Samaritan, I wonder if things through your teaching world religions and then being a guest, I would love to hear you talk more about that, if there's wherever you might want to take that.
I hadn't thought of it, but that does go straight to the classroom. When you're teaching world religions in rural Northeast Georgia, with predominantly Christian students who've really, really been taught stereotypical things about people of other faiths. We'd start out every semester putting the 5 major religions we would cover on the board: Judaism, Christianity in the West, and then Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Well, actually, let's put Islam with the Abrahamic traditions. I can't even remember my blackboard anymore. But I would ask students on the first day to write under those what they knew about them. And when you got to Hinduism, there was nothing.
Yeah.
Maybe there was an elephant. Maybe there was a red dot on the forehead. So oddly, there were not as many stereotypes about that because people didn't know much. But Islam, good grief. Terrorist was always right near the top, and it would go on down from there. But so much of that class was about, I didn't say a word to students. I gave them things to read. I took them on field trips, and I showed them videotapes of real people who belonged to those traditions. Over and over again, their papers just said, that's not what I thought they were at all. Yeah. Or that person was so regular, or she was so nice to me on the field trip, or he pulled out chairs for our group, or they gave us, any book we wanted off the bookshelf. And it was so much fun to watch those beliefs about the strange otherness of those non-Christians just go, yeah. And sometimes I want to say, put a few of those up. Don't completely, walk into any place in the world and expect people to be like our field trip hosts, because they won't be. But it was wonderful to see stereotypes fracture and fall when people encountered in their lives people who didn't conform to their beliefs. Yeah. And you and I could tell 100 other kinds of stories. People have a lot of beliefs about what they are like, or they are like, or all those boundaries we draw. Yeah. And it's really a great relief after it's a great trouble for those to be exploded.
Yes, that was. It was either in this book or in Holy Envy where you talked about the high cost of kind of doing this kind of religious diversity, or taking other faiths, whether it's other religions or other Christian denominations seriously, that there can be a high cost in doing that. And I imagine some of it is letting your own beliefs crumble. A big one, you talked about this in one of the chapters, is from John 14, no one comes to the Father except through me. And I've gotten to wear at funerals, thinking about having a lot of guests, I've gotten to wear at funerals when people want to use that passage, I like to leave that line off, because what does that say to people? But that's one of the beliefs that we might need to let crumble as Christians, I think.
I just had 9 thoughts go through my mind while you're saying
Good,
that.
please say them so I stop talking and digging myself
No.
hole.
It's just, I know what went by though, that came up a lot with that book, the Holy Envy book. Not so much, this is all Christian. This is my most Christian book in ages. But with Holy Envy, what came up too was how eager people were to learn about other religions, but they did not want to hang out with Christians who were not like them. Yeah. To get a Baptist and a Mormon talking to each other could be dangerous. And it was interesting to, I'd come in with my white, middle class, upper class stereotypes of worship, or sermon should be short, or contemplation, and some African American students would say, are you crazy? that doesn't sound like anything I know as
Yeah.
worship. I mean, we come alive in worship. It sounds to me like you go to sleep in worship.
Yeah.
So it's really, although that was a fun conversation, that one was, but it was so interesting to turn students loose, asking each other questions about their very different experiences.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them went to community churches that didn't identify denominations. But one student came back and said, well, how are you active at your church? He said, well, I do the flag dance and the sword dance.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
those were things that happened every Sunday at his church.
Yeah.
And that was a white evangelical student. So,
Wow.
he met in a storefront church. So that is actually where some hackles would come up for people, because it's like, that's a family argument, right?
Right.
Wait a minute, you're a Christian? You think you're a Christian? You do that? You believe that? So those were actually more heated than any conversations about Christian, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish relations.
I could see that. I could see that.
It's a lot of fun. Well, thank you for picking that one out.
I loved that. I thought that, and I thought I'd love to hear Barbara talk about, how your beliefs have been changed by life. So anyway, it's a question I will hang on to. Are we ready for questions? Thank you.
And if you're watching, I keep looking to my left because you are still here, though you're off camera. But the wonderful Terry who introduced us is still here, so I'm not looking at the wall. And our questions are coming in from that side.
So our questions are coming in from viewers, so thank you.
Oh, and thanks to all of you who bought books, because I sat here for an hour and a half and signed books, and I loved seeing all of your notes and writing to your friends and writing what you said for me to write to your friends. So thank you.
So the first question is, why were there so many sermons, I guess, or chapters from the Chautauqua Institute?
Oh, because when I go to Chautauqua, great question. It's a huge place in upstate New York. There'd be 5,000 people there on a Sunday morning and a couple of hundred every day of the week. And if you were chaplain, there was a theme for the week that didn't have to do with the religion department. So there would be social scientists and I wanted to say politicians, but I was trying to think public servant was the word I was looking for there. And educators would come in, and the theme for that week was money. It was about money and power. And I had never been asked to think about preaching a whole week about money and power. And it was the most fun in the world to go through the Gospels looking for passages about money. Yeah, because Jesus said way more about money than he said about sexuality or anything else. So that's why there's so many, is I'd never been given that challenge before. So they still felt fresh to me, like fresh sermons, because I was forced to see some familiar passages differently.
Yeah.
There was a water week one other time I went. Those did not make it in. But to think about water in the Bible, from the Nile River to the Jordan River it was amazing to just be given a lens and then have to go think of 7 sermons that would be around that. Because I'm not a sermon series person, but that's why. It's because Chautauqua gave me that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and that was some of these are, that's a good point to make too, that some of the sermons are set, many of the sermons were delivered at churches, but some are at graduations. There's Chautauqua Institute. I don't remember where you gave the one about art and beauty, but
no, that was at a Presbyterian church in Florida, but they were co-sponsoring a community-wide event with, what's the college? There was a famous college real near them in, let's just change the subject because my brain is as old as it is.
Subject change.
Okay, but yeah, that was fun, and that was a community venture that a church had engaged in. With Eckerd College. See, that's my lapse time, 5 seconds.
Thank you, yes. It makes me feel better to know that you have those as well.
I do. It's COVID brain.
Yes. Do you have a new book in the works?
I hate that question because I should. I have 3 ideas and I've learned not to say them because then people say, how's the book on so-and-so going? And then I'm in the same position.
Yeah.
But yes, I have 3 ideas.
I imagine you always have books in, when you're collecting sermons that you've given over the last 20 years or so, you probably always in some ways have a book in the works.
Yeah, but that's the last sermon book. There won't be any more of those. And so the ones I'm interested in now, they'll get shorter and shorter and shorter. But I am interested in one this doesn't have to do with tonight particularly, but I've just finished 2 years with Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio in a course called Forest Dwelling, Spirituality for the Last Third of Life. And that has been amazing, to dive headlong into aging. And the pandemic, in a lot of ways, has people of every age thinking about mortality.
Absolutely.
And limits and endings and things that are dying. Though I still live, there are things that are dying and aren't going to come back. So there's a book in there somewhere, Aging at Any Age.
Yeah, there's definitely a book in there, and I will read it when you write it. I think there's a huge need to think about age. Well,
At
people
any
do.
age.
Yeah. Definitely think about mortality right now. But this is an interesting question that I am interested in as well. How has your faith experience changed, but says since you left priesthood, but since you left parish ministry?
And I never had children of my own, but I've heard parents say the same thing. I could never do enough for my child. I couldn't protect him or her enough. And I've had clergy friends say, well, you know, you didn't have good boundaries, you know, or that wouldn't have been a problem. But it was a huge problem to me to feel as if I was always coming up short, always. And there's something about not being someone's parish priest anymore that freed me, you know, not only to dress differently, but to offer myself in different ways than I had before. You know, where baking a casserole was as important as saying a good prayer. And so it freed up my compulsiveness about how I was priest.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
It makes so much sense.
So that's all, is it was some kind of inner permission that I could do it differently because I wasn't responsible to the community I was talking to you about earlier in the same way.
Yeah.
And you know, I never could put a bumper sticker on my car because it reflected on my community.
Yeah.
You know, so there are ways in which I can be slightly more wild as a not parish priest.
Yeah.
So that's how it changed. Was I granted myself some freedoms I did not grant myself
Yeah.
before.
And it sounds like you gave yourself I'm curious, and this may be me wondering personally, so you're saying you felt like you never could do enough. And
I know I never did
that,
enough.
if you don't have that now, has that sense of not enoughness and not doing enoughness gone away?
Now see, that's very astute. I'm going to have to write you a check at the end of this time. No, I think it's still there, but it's residual. And
Yeah.
see, then I retired from teaching because I also couldn't do enough as a teacher. So that's very astute.
Well, because otherwise, if that was the answer, then I was like, okay.
No, my character flaws remain intact. It's just
Yeah.
they eased up a little bit.
Yeah, because I definitely have that not enoughness character flaw.
I'm beginning to think that's part of the human condition. We just don't talk about it all the time. And I think women think we have it worse than men. It's not so.
Yeah,
It's just the topic changes of what they're not enough of.
yeah. And that's something you've taught me about preaching just through your writing, is the more honest you are, I think, about what's going on in here, the more it resonates with other people, if they kind of see their own truth in there and feel less alien to the human race.
Yeah, you got to work on your humanity.
Yeah. So here's another question. Do you have guidelines or suggestions to those who are questioning received teachings?
Guidelines or questions. I think it's great to question received teachings. But I don't toss them, because here's the virtue of received teachings is if I'm lucky, I might get 6-7 years. I've buried people with far fewer years than I have. But to be in a faith or in a religion or a tradition is to receive this wisdom, you know, that's pan-generational and pan-national and goes all over the place. So I don't want to toss it, but it's secondhand. And so I want to test it against firsthand. And I always want to be open to the Spirit, you know, to the Trinity, to my fellow human beings, to call me out, to either put my received teachings to work, you know, show me your received teachings. Where can I see them at work? Because if they don't have hit the ground value, if they don't have verbs attached, I don't know what good they are.
Right.
So I think questioning received teachings is required.
Yeah.
But I watch people toss them pretty fast, and I say, careful, you'll end up with only your lifespan. You'll end up with only your life to call on. So it's nice to keep a community that is older than that and wider than that.
And, you know, I think something that you have done what you're saying about received teachings, you model with the way you approach the Bible, which is, sometimes when you hang in there with something that makes no sense or that gets your goat up or whatever, if you hang in there with it and really wrestle with it, then there's fruit on the other side. There may be a cost, but there's also fruit and a deepening. So,
And see that, before you get the next question, that's what I envy about Judaism is the Talmud, which is hundreds of years of engaging in sacred debate about the texts and revering what's there, but having freedom to explore and suppose things about what's not there, and the ways in which that was never unfaith. That was the highest faith, because the text was worth doing that with. And I don't think Christians have got that same tradition. We certainly have nothing like Talmud.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got John Wesley's commentaries, God bless him, and all of our heroes and our different traditions. But anyhow, that's something I continue to envy about the mother faith.
I envy that too. But it seems like we can do the same thing with those received teachings that we can do with Scripture. Do you have any formal contemplative prayer or meditation? Wrestle with it, then there's fruit on the other side. There may be a cost, but there's also fruit and a deepening. So,
And see that, before you get the next question, that's what I envy about Judaism is the Talmud, which is hundreds of years of engaging in sacred debate about the texts and revering what's there, but having freedom to explore and suppose things about what's not there, and the ways in which that was never unfaith. That was the highest faith, because the text was worth doing that with. And I don't think Christians have got that same tradition. We certainly have nothing like Talmud.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got John Wesley's commentaries, God bless him, and all of our heroes and our different traditions. But anyhow, that's something I continue to envy about the mother faith.
I envy that too. But it seems like we can do the same thing with those received teachings that we can do with Scripture. Do you have any formal contemplative prayer or meditation practices now?
Yeah, but they won't satisfy most people who really understand what contemplative prayer is, because it's got a rhythm and a continuity and twice a day, minimum 20 minutes to it. And I've spent years doing that morning and evening. This is not one of those years. So my contemplative practice is more like Brother Lawrence, who learned how to clean the kitchen floor for the love of God, and who would pick up a broom straw off the floor for the love of God. So my challenge, especially living where I live now, is to go through the day just in dialogue with the divine that's jumping out at me from all over the place. And actually being a priest has been hugely helpful, because the sacramental nature of everything is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. If you've got the eyes to see it and the hands to touch it and hold it up, because what priests do is hold stuff up to God, right? And then break and share. So that's my contemplative practice this year. 2020 has been more that way. But I was thinking just the other day, it's time to go back to that rhythm. More like daily offices. I'll do morning, evening meditation. So there's time in a long, thank God, life to do that a lot of different ways.
And it's a good reminder, that our prayer life changes in different seasons. And something else that I really appreciated in your writing, but I mean, I can't remember, it was all during the world, but saying, somebody asked me about my prayer life, and that's like the worst question. I've talked about this in a sermon, that's how I do this so well. I'd rather, check pay stubs or something like that.
Let me share how much I've spent at the liquor store. Don't ask me about my prayer life.
But that's a relief also, I think, for those of us who struggle with prayer, or, beat oursells up because we think that we're not doing it right or we're not doing it enough.
Karen Armstrong, who's written so many genius books, she was at Chautauqua. I met her in a kitchen there, and people ask her that often about her prayer life, and she said, my study is my prayer. My academic study is how I meet God, and it's my quiet time, and it's my prayer time. And I just thought she probably didn't even put that many religious words on it, but I so respected her not hemming and hawing and saying that which I've given my life to is my prayer. So she was my teacher on that.
Absolutely.
We have no more questions. That means we have satisfied everyone.
All the
We have
answers.
satisfied
Everyone's
everyone. That
answered
is
every
so
question.
wonderful. Thank you all for tuning in. I don't know how Corey wants to end this, but I'm just so grateful that I got this invitation because like a lot of you, I've done Zooms, but I've never done one like this, you know. So there are 6 of us here and we're pretty far apart.
We are, and we might just stay and talk for 2 more hours.
Yeah, but it's been wonderful to be with you this way. And if I hear from some of you by email, let me know this is the way we met. So.
And I want to thank you both for taking time during Advent to be with us. You've given us so much to think about. And I especially want to thank you for how faithful you've been to our bookstore.
Oh, I love it.
It has been, it's so meaningful. There's a real community that follows you. But it means a lot to us to know that you will come and make the time. We are not close to Habersham County.
It's my pleasure. I remember this bookstore from way, way back, Jane Baird days, down in the
Oh,
basement. So,
Yes, yes, I love those memories.
thank you.
And thank you all for
We
joining
actually
us.
do have one more question.
No, we're
This
finished.
is Richard Shook. Your father Earl was my supervisor at GSU. Have you been influenced by any of his work in Gestalt or other GSU professors, such as Ray Craddock's interest in Jung? Earl was one of the most authentic people I have ever known, and your authenticity has always resonated with me.
I'm gonna cry. My daddy died in 2002. I'm his oldest son. I always was. He taught me to throw knives and hunt and stuff, which may not sound like him if you knew him as your professor, but no, he brought none of his work home ever. And I think what I did learn from him was he loved his work. That was not a man who ever came home and said, oh, I'm so tired. He drug himself home. There were nights I think he would rather have still been at work. He loved his students. He loved his work with graduate students, and he loved his psychotherapy practice. So I have a little curled hair that's like his, and I bear his mark. He's one of my creators. So I bear the mark of the Divine Father and the human Father very, very much, and think of him often. So thanks for that being the last remembrance. I shipped all of his papers to the University of Akron, where they're part of the history of psychology in the US. So I think I weighed as much as the papers when I sent them, but everything's in there from his high school papers on. So he left them to me to decide what to do with. So they're there for some graduate student to make hay with one day.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
All right.